Just the other day, we pitted the 7700X against the 5800X 3D in a bit of a showdown to see whether clock speed or greater levels of cache made the biggest difference. And with a small difference in price, which CPU was the better buy? And it was pretty clear that the newer Ryzen 7 7700X was the slightly better buy, with slightly more performance at 1080p and with a better cost per frame, though they did kind of taper off as we went through the resolutions. It also gave some longevity to the platform, as the 5800X 3D is kind of old news now. So with that in mind, I wanted to see how things stacked up between the 7700X and 7800X 3D in 42 games, because this time the platform is the same, but the price difference is much larger, but the performance should be too. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits for my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. So let's quickly run through the specs. First up, both the 7700X and 7800X 3D are 8-core 16-thread processors, so similar on that front. But beyond that, there are some quite stark differences. The 7700X comes in with a 4.5 GHz clock speed and 5.4 GHz boost speed, while the 7800X 3D comes in slightly less at 4.2 GHz on the clock speed and a still impressive 5 GHz on the boost clock. So on paper, the 7700X has the advantage, as long as the game can harness raw brute speed. The big difference, as I'm sure you're all aware, comes down to the cache. While the 7700X comes in with 32 meg of L3 cache, the 7800X 3D, due to its stacked V cache, comes in with 96 megabytes. And again, depending on the game, this can be a huge difference in terms of performance. And that's what makes these head-to-heads kind of so interesting, and also why we test so many games, to get a more rounded, better view of the situation across a bigger pool of games. So speaking of games, we went through and tested both CPUs on 42 titles. To test, we used the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master with 32 gig of G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo 6000 MHz CL30 memory. For all of our testing, we used an Inno3D RTX 4090 iChill X30C to rid the system of any GPU-based bottlenecks, and the latest version of Windows 11 was used with the latest drivers. All of the testing data is fresh, so everything is as up-to-date as it can be, and while we'll be showing 1080, 1440 and 4K, 1080p really is the focus here, as this is where the CPU utilization is at its highest. We've tested both processors in a total of 42 games, and we'll be showing 15 here today, while also looking at the percentage differences between the two in all 42 titles. Though if you do want to see the individual data for all 42 games, then we will be putting them up onto our Patreon, where you also get a ton of other cool and exclusive benefits, as well as helping to support everything that we do on the channel. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, and right away we can see that there isn't really much between the two CPUs at any of the resolutions, with 1080p seeing the 7800X 3D sitting ahead by a margin of error 3%. 1440p switches things up, and now the 7700X is the one ahead, but this is again only a margin of error increase, this time by about 1.5%. Then at 4K the averages become identical, with just a single FPS between the two in the 1% lows. So with nothing but margin of error results, it's safe to say that this game will feel pretty much the same no matter what CPU you have out of these two. Moving over to Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where the gap begins to widen, and at 1080p we find the 7800X 3D performing 7% higher than the 7700X. This gap falls comfortably outside a margin of error, but the frame rates here are quite high, so you're not likely to really notice much difference when playing. 1440p sees the difference get a little smaller, as you'd expect from a higher resolution, and now the 7800X 3D only sits ahead by 5%, which is still above margin of error, but we are edging closer to it. 4K is even closer in performance, and now the difference is just under 4%, so you could argue that the performance here is now nigh on identical. Baldur's Gate 3 is next, and here we see some massive gains in favour of the 7800X3D, so this game clearly takes advantage of the 3D V-cache. At 1080p, the difference is a staggering 54% more performance than the averages, whilst the 1% low figure on the 7800X3D more or less matches the average performance of the 7700X. Now, I found myself saying a lot recently that you wouldn't be able to notice the difference, but this kind of increase is something that you can't not notice. 1440p has a smaller but still noticeable gap of 38%, which is still nothing to turn your nose up at. Then 4K sees things narrow as the CPU offloads some of the work to the GPU, though this still has the 7800X3D coming in 7% faster. On to Call of Duty, and here we see the CPUs essentially matching each other. The 7800X3D is still ahead by a small margin of 2% at 1080p and doesn't provide much more in the lows either, where we see 4% more performance overall. Then at 1440p we have the exact same performance in the averages, with only 1% between the 1% low figures, this time in favour to the 7700X, but retesting could see all that change. 4K sees the CPU split apart by a single FPS, which of course is margin of error, and we see the same thing in the 1% lows. So really in this game, there isn't actually that much to talk about. Our next game is Counter-Strike 2, where we have some weird performance like we usually do in this title, but we also see some pretty impressive jumps in performance. At 1080p, the game favours the 7800X3D by 11%, while 1440p gives us a lot wider of a gap, with 20% in favour of the 3D V-cache CPU. Then at 4K we see a slight drop to 15%, which is more of a difference than we saw at 1080p, but throughout this game we have managed to see a consistent jump from the 7800X3D, so clearly this game is able to take advantage of that extra cache. In Cyberpunk 2077 we see 1080p and 1440p clearly taking advantage of the 3D V-cache of the 7800X3D, with 22 and 20% more performance than the 7700X at 1080p and 1440p respectively. 4K naturally sees the performance dropping and we see a gap of just a single FPS on average. So whilst the game is able to take advantage of the 7800X3D, it becomes so intensive at 4K that we really don't rely on the CPU as much, and the GPU is pretty much doing all of the work. When we turn on ray tracing we see the same kind of thing but to a lesser degree. At 1080p the difference is at its largest as you'd expect, and there we see a difference of 13% in favour again to the 7800X3D. This gap becomes almost unnoticeable at 1440p, with the 7800X3D pushing just 2% ahead of the 7700X. Then at 4K both CPUs perform identically in both the averages and the 1% lows. F123 normally has some very high frame rates, so I can easily see the difference that comes from different CPUs, and this game is another one that can utilise the 3D V-cache, and this results in a difference of 21% at 1080p and 17% at 1440p, in favour again to the 7800X3D. This is again a much smaller difference once we reach 4K, where we find the 7800X3D still ahead, but only by a mere 2%. But with frame rates reaching over 300 FPS, you're not likely to even notice some of the bigger jumps in frame rate anyway. Moving over to Far Cry 6 sees the same kind of performance that we saw in F1. The 7800X3D at 1080 and 1440p sees 18% and 10% more performance respectively, which is a pretty big jump in performance over the 7700X, but considering the X3D chip comes in 27% more expensive, it does still miss the mark somewhat. Then in typical fashion at 4K the performance draws closer, and the 7700X actually manages to fall to a margin of error 1% better on average. In Hogwarts Legacy we see this trend continue, as with 1080p we see the 7800X3D performing 20% higher than the 7700X, and at 1440p we see a smaller but still decent 14% more performance in the averages, showing that the 3D V-cache does a very good job of boosting performance of games, especially at lower resolutions. As we move up to 4K, where the CPU isn't utilised as much, again they're indistinguishable from one another, as the two CPUs have exactly the same performance in both the averages and the 1% lows. Next up is Spider-Man Remastered, and here we can see even more of the same. 1080p has the two CPUs sitting 18% apart from each other in the averages, with a slightly smaller 17% in the lows, all in favour to the 7800X3D. Then at 1440p we have the 7700X dropping by quite a few frames, whilst the 7800X3D doesn't really take much of a hit, and as a result we end up with an even bigger performance gap of 24%, which of course disappears at 4K as the GPU takes over and has the CPUs take a back seat, as now the two processors are more or less seeing the same frame rates, but the 7800X3D does have a slight edge in the 1% lows, Not by enough to be noticeable of course, but still worth pointing out. When we enable ray tracing, we actually see something a bit different, not much different, but different nonetheless. Between 1080 and 1440p, the CPUs didn't really see much of a drop in frame rates, and as a result, the performance is pretty much the same. And the differences between the two processors is only just outside of margin of error, with 4% more and 5% more performance at 1080p and 1440p respectively. To no one's surprise, 4K is again seeing the two chips performing pretty much identically, with the average FPS matching on both CPUs and the 1% low FPS being separated by only 5%, which isn't margin of error, but the frame rates are lower here, so it actually only works out as 4 FPS difference in favour to the 7800X3D. Next up is Microsoft Flight Simulator, and this game is pretty well known to like X3D CPUs, and this is no exception, with the 7800X3D managing to push out 27% more performance at 1080p on average, which is pretty impressive, but not as impressive as 1440p, where the 7800X3D actually gains some performance, and now the processors are 38% apart in performance, again in favour of the 7800X3D. Even 4K manages to see a benefit from the X3D part, as performance still comes in 17% higher than the 7700X, which, don't get me wrong, still manages to hold its own, but based on the performance across the resolutions, you can see that it's still severely limited. Our penultimate game is Remnant 2, and with this title we only see 1080p making a big difference, and as this game is quite well known for being graphically intensive, this at least makes sense. 1080p, as mentioned, is the biggest performance boost that we see, with 16% more performance in favour to the 7800X3D. But then, as mentioned, this quickly falls back down to margin of error at 1440p, where the 7800X3D only manages to outperform the 7700X by just 1%. Then 4K also only sees a 1% difference between the two CPUs, but this time in favour to the 7700X. Then lastly, we're looking at Watch Dogs Legion, and here we're seeing the 7800X3D making one last push to prove that it is the better of the two CPUs. At 1080p, it manages to push out 25% more performance over the 7700X, while 1440p does see this margin drop to a lesser, but still impressive 17%. Then finally at 4K, things change quite dramatically, and now the 7700X outperforms the 7800X3D by 3 FPS. This isn't enough to come outside of margin of error, but it still isn't a great look for the more expensive 3D Vcache based CPU. So I think it's safe to say that went pretty much the way it was expected to. The 7800X3D is the stronger of the two CPUs at 1080p, which is where CPUs play a bigger part. But the big question doesn't just come down to which one is better, but instead by how much, because while some games can harness the potential of 3D Vcache, not every game is geared like that, or at least not to the same degree as others. That's pretty clear to see in our percentage difference charts, where the 7800X3D does come in faster by 13% overall, with the biggest win coming by way of Baldur's Gate 3 at 55%. There are some other noticeable wins like Hunt Showdown at 42% and Warhammer 40,000 Darktide at 33%. And I'm wanting to highlight these as they give more performance than the extra outlay of cost of the 7800X3D. Beyond that, there's still a lot of wins for the 7800X3D, ranging from 1% faster in Forza Horizon 5 to Watch Dogs Legion at 25%. While the 7700X does take a win of 3% by way of Horizon Forbidden West, but this is such a low difference that it's arguably identical performance. Now when it comes to the 1% lows, it's very much a similar story. The biggest win to the 7800X3D comes in at 58% on Hunt Showdown, with every other game barring Horizon Forbidden West, Doom Eternal with ray tracing enabled and Dirt 5 favouring the X3D CPU, and Alan Wake 2 with ray tracing on with matched performance. So beyond this, it's a pretty solid victory, leading to the 7800X3D coming in 14% faster overall. So when looking at things from a performance standpoint, the 7800X3D looks good. There's no doubt about that, and it was pretty much expected too. While the 7700X is a solid CPU, the X3D is faster, but it's also more expensive, so you'd like to think that if you pay more, you get more. And that's most certainly the case, but when you start drilling down into the overall value of the chips, that's where things get a bit more interesting. When we look at the cost per frame, the overall average does have the 7800X3D winning in every resolution, though at 4K we're only talking a single frame per second, while the extra cost that the 7800X3D demands helps to paint a better picture of the bang for buck, as at 1080p we find the 7700X coming in at $1.33 per frame, whereas the 7800X3D comes in at $1.52, which puts it 14% more expensive per frame. 1440p sees this increase to 18% more expensive for the X3D, and 4K sees an even worse 27% higher cost. And it's a hard one to look at because I'm all about getting more performance for more money, but it has to line up somewhat. And in the case of the 7800X3D, that's just not the case. AMD have done a great job with the 7000 series, but you could argue that they've done too good of a job with the 7700X and not enough for the X3D in either the term of performance or overall cost, because they can both end up relating to each other as shown here today. So the big question, which one do you buy? I want to try and play devil's advocate and say that both have their place, which they do. Though we have released a video lately showing that the 7600X is even better value than the 7700X. So you could argue that the 7600X is the best value CPU out of the series of what we tested. But there's definitely more to it than that, especially as newer games like Baldur's Gate 3 showed us some very, very sizable gains. If more games are released like that moving forward, then it will become a bit of a no-brainer. And that's why we test in so many titles to get a more rounded picture of exactly what's going on. But based on what we saw today, the 7700X does offer better value, and that's what I'm all about. I love getting the extra performance from the 7800X3D, but it gets to a point where you're just aimlessly throwing money away and getting even less in return. And that, at least to me, doesn't make any sense. As I said, newer games could see this whole thing kind of flip on its side, but for now, these are the numbers. And while they are higher on the 7800X3D, the main number, in terms of cost, is also higher. I mean, higher than what you get in return, shall we say. And that needs to change. Not by much, but enough to at least match what you get for your money. So there we have it. Another AMD video done. And I think it was, well, quite an interesting one, as there really is an argument for both sides of the coin. So let me know, which way would you be more inclined to go? Better value for money, or is money not that important and any amount of extra performance is worth it to you? Let me know in the comments section below. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can help support us over on Patreon, where you get a ton of really cool benefits, including exclusive behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, access to all of our charts, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.